Hello everybody, welcome back to Source ADV. I am Mark Jackson. I'm very excited today. I got my ultimate kind of single track build here out of a 2019 YZ250X. It is street legal. It's got pretty much everything you can possibly do to a bike, minus a few little mods. And I'm very excited to kind of walk you through everything I did to this bike to make it the ultimate kind of rough single track bike. Stay tuned.
Hey.
So yes, this is a street legal 2019 YZ250X cross-country dirt bike that's been pushed more towards rough single track riding. So the YZ250X is a super reliable, super kind of tried and true old bike, kickstart, you know, the aluminum frame from 2006, but it still handles and rides fantastic. But there are some things you got to do to kind of make it ready for riding in just really rough single track. Now, I'm not really saying that it's going to be that this particular bike is great for hard enduro. In a hard enduro, you'd probably want an electric start bike, a wide ratio transmission, and be able to kind of just crawl when you need to, and you're going to stall a bunch and that sort of thing. This particular bike was built for kind of rough, rocky single track like we have here in Arizona and where I used to live in Colorado. So with that being said, whenever you'd be going into some rough, rocky, tree-filled single track, you're going to want to do a lot of things to first protect the bike, right? And yourself. The bike has some Cycra wraparound hand guards that mount to the bars, super straightforward. It's got like an AXP full coverage skid plate that has a nice linkage cover too that's really good for kind of sliding over logs and rocks. I've got a bulletproof designs, rear disc guard, E-line pipe guard for an FMF pipe. We've got a TM chain guide. I think I already bent the original stock chain guide in, just hitting it on rocks. It's aluminum. The same thing went for, I had a Tusk rear disc guard on there too, and over time that one bent in as well. And then on top of that, besides just the protection of the bike, you're probably going to need more range out of the bike if you want to be doing like 60 to 75 mile rides. So I've got the Acerbis, I think it's a 3.2 extended range tank. So kind of just getting yourself set up for just getting into single track riding with the YZ250X. At a bare minimum, you're probably going to want like hand guards and a nice skid plate. And everything else is just kind of like a nice to have. Now, moving beyond that, to kind of address the power of the bike and the type of power that I wanted out of this bike for, you know, chuggability and being able to be ridden both slow and really fast, but, you know, have a very nice linear power band, I went right around the jetting problem. I tried having the stock carb with the JD jetting kit. It still was super finicky. I very regularly go from 8,000 feet down to 3,000 feet where I'm at in Flagstaff and where I was at in Colorado. So I just cut all that out, went right to the Smart Carb, and I've got a bunch of videos on the Smart Carb if you want to learn more about that. There should be a link up here, somewhere over here in the video. Maybe it's over here. I don't know. Somewhere right here, I'll throw a link to those Smart Carb videos. I am super impressed with the Smart Carb. It's smoothed out the power band. The YZ used to have this kind of dip in the middle range of the bike, and a lot of people address that with a high compression RK Tech head or one of those similar kind of like squish band fixing heads. I found that the Smart Carb made the bike run really, really well at all elevations. And on top of that, I threw in an FMF gnarly pipe and a Turbine Core 2 silencer to add a spark arrestor. In the power department, one other thing that I did add besides the Smart Carb, the pipe, and the exhaust was a V-Force 3 reed valve. For those who don't know, the V-Force 3 reed valve is a slightly different design inside from a traditional reed valve, and it just gives it a little bit more surface area to get more fuel and air into the bike. And I noticed that the throttle response and the kind of the crispness of the bike definitely increased a lot. So V-Force 3 on this bike is a good mod. And the combination of that with the Smart Carb and the pipe made this bike really, really liven up as a very good kind of low mid-range hit. It's perfect for single track riding. And then the over rev of the bike is fantastic too. You can just keep ringing it out as far as you want. So really cool. Bike runs great. And I'm glad I didn't have to put one of those RK Tech heads on. So it's not necessarily about the power of the bike, but I did notice that with the stock clutch on the YZ250X, maybe it was because I added the FMF gnarly pipe, the Smart Carb, and all this other stuff, and there's just a little bit more torque down below. But with the stock clutch of the YZ250X, yes, the clutch pull with the cable stock clutch was really light, but I did notice that the thing would slip a fair amount when you're doing some really kind of hard climbing on a rocky broody stuff. So what I went ahead and did, and I added an EBC heavy duty clutch. So it has heavy duty clutch springs, then replaced the cable actuated clutch with a Magura hydraulic, I think they call it the high mech clutch. And what ended up happening was the clutch pull is about the same or even lighter than the factory cable operated clutch. And the thing just hooks up so much better. It doesn't slip anymore. You can really just modulate it and get traction to the rear tire really, really well. Yeah, and I really, really like this hydraulic clutch. The lever is a lot longer than, say, the KTM hydraulic clutches, but it's actually a little bit of a lighter pull than, say, my 500 XCFW, which is a Brembo hydraulic clutch, I think. Something like that. But yeah, if you have a YZ250X and you end up going to a heavy duty clutch and you're like, oh man, this is way too hard to pull, well, swap out your cable clutch and go to a Magura high mech system. Yeah, it's fantastic, and you no longer have to adjust the clutch ever again, which is awesome. So the bike is both, OHV friendly and it's street legal, so that's pretty darn cool. Honestly, even before the power, I'd say one of the most important things if you're going to be riding a YZ250X just on single track to adjust, especially if you're like me, who's someone that's around 200 pounds, is to change the suspension around. I had my suspension done by Enduro Spec, which is a shop out of Colorado. It's run by a racer named Warren, and this thing just went from a bike that kind of wasn't really happy anywhere. It had places where it was too stiff. It had places where it was, like if you started jumping too much, it was too soft. And Warren took the bike and made it kind of perfect for single track. It can still hit really big whoops if you need it to, and it just handles so much better for single track riding. So if you're not happy with your YZ250X, or if you're looking to get a YZ250X, just know that stock suspension, even though the KYB suspension on the Yamahas is kind of the best out of the box, it's still not tailor-made for getting yourself into rough single track riding. So talk to my buddy Warren at Enduro Spec. You'll be super happy. It's super plush at the bottom, and then it can absorb anything you can possibly throw at it. It's really great. The next thing I addressed in the bike was the traction. The stock tires, not great for most single track riding. I always run the Tubliss system, so I've got Tubliss front rear on this bike. I run about 9.5 PSI in the front and around 8 in the rear. That seems to be like a perfect combination of having enough rigidity with these golden tires. It's a GT or GA 216 in the front. It's not the fatty, it's the regular width stock tire in the front. And then it's the GT 333, I think it's a 110 in the rear. Combination of the Tubliss system in those tires seems to just find traction everywhere. It doesn't matter whether it's wet, sandy, rocky, whatever. This bike will just crawl up anything. So I highly recommend you look at both Tubliss and the golden tires if you have not yet. There's a lot of stuff out there on Tubliss. I've got a video on installing Tubliss if you need to take a look at that. But there's plenty of resources out there. The Tubliss system is fantastic. And also, I've probably here in Arizona with like the cactus and barbed wire everywhere, I think I've got like 3 or 4 plugs just in these tires alone. But you can literally just plug it like it's, like a tube car tire and get back riding in 3 to 5 minutes versus having to pull your tire and change out a tube or patch a tube. So that's great. One of the other things to know about the YZ250X out of the box is that it's definitely not geared for any type of rough single track with climbs. When you first get the bike, you'll notice that it just doesn't have very slow low end when you really need it and you need to pull yourself out of a hole or get up some really, really rough rocky stuff. So I ended up going with 1349 gearing. I believe the stock was 1450. So what that ended up doing was essentially adding, it's the equivalent of adding 2.5 teeth to the rear sprocket without having to change the chain length. If you ended up adding 3 teeth to the rear while using the stock 14 tooth front sprocket, you probably have to add a slightly longer chain by 2 links or 1 link, depending on where you want to place your rear wheel in the swing arm. So I found that the 1349 was a really good balance of having very slow speed capabilities for doing log jumps, rocky climbs, that sort of thing when you needed it. But the only downside is that for a street legal bike like this, you can definitely tell that it's pretty much topped out on pavement, for a happy place around 60 to 65 miles an hour. I only know that because we were riding it today, and I had my other bike, and we knew we were going roughly like 60, and this bike was definitely it wasn't all the way wound out, but you're definitely getting to the top of the RPM range. The other thing, on top of the gearing, the other thing that really helps with the luggability of this bike, meaning the ability to just kind of climb up anything, or when you really have to go, you're really slow and kind of pick your way through stuff, which is really helpful when you only have a kickstart. You really don't want to stall because it sucks to kickstart when you're like pinned between rocks, was the Yamaha 8.4 ounce flywheel. It was plus, basically Yamaha makes a flywheel that has 8 ounces more of weight on it, which helps the bike along at low RPMs. It keeps a little bit more momentum in the engine, a little bit more energy in the engine at low RPMs. I didn't notice any change in the bike in the mid-range or the top end. And the combination of that and the Smart Carb really worked well together for really kind of those lugging scenarios. The stock YZ250X is a little bit more temperamental, a little bit more of a cross-country bike. So if you're going to be taking it more like single tracky, where you kind of have a larger variety of terrain, you might want to take a look at that weighted flywheel as well to go with the gearing on the bike. The other thing that's really cool about this bike that I've mentioned a few times already is that it is street legal. And I've got a bunch of videos that I'll either share here and here about how I made this bike street legal. Long story short, it's got a Ricky Stator 30 or 35 watt improved stator. It's got a voltage regulator rectifier. It's got a battery that I added into the airbox. And then it has a very simple pull switch right here for this Baja Designs Squadron Sport MC light and a Tusk rear tail light, brake light with a switch that's activated off the rear brake. I've got a whole bunch of videos on that you can check out if you want to figure out how to make your YZ250X street legal. But it's really cool to know that I can, confidently ride through the center of town and I'm not going to get arrested or pulled over. And then also if I get stuck on a trail too late and it gets dark, got plenty of light here. This front light is amazing. And the other thing that's kind of cool, or not cool, but the other benefit is that you end up having to swap your front brake line to make it work with this headlight fairing. So I went with the Galfer front brake line, and I noticed too that it made the front brake a lot more responsive and a lot there's a lot less travel to it, which I really liked because the Nissan brakes on the YZ250X are not traditionally that great. So check out the other videos that I have on my channel about making this bike street legal, but it's really cool to have a two-stroke kind of kickstart race bike out on the street. There's a kind of like a rebellious, youthful teen element to it that's really fun. So I highly recommend that. Kind of from a control and height perspective, so I'm 6'1". This bike felt really small and compact. The riding triangle of the bike just didn't fit me that well. So I actually had to modify some Fastway Evo 4 foot pegs. They're not supposed to work in the low position on this bike, and I've got a video on that as well that you can watch right here. So check out the description, or I'll throw a link up here. But basically, I figured out a way to make the Fastway 4 Evo 4 foot pegs work on this bike, which brought me an inch, half inch down and like a quarter inch back. And then on top of that, I added this seat concept tall seat. And then we've got these big BRP handlebar mounts that are rubber that basically lift the mounts up about 1 inch. So the combination of those three things really made this bike kind of make it feel more comfortable for me for my ride height, and also just comfortable for longer stand-up rides. On single track riding, you're almost constantly standing up the whole time. So you have to make sure that you're comfortable while still being, you can still very easily get into a kind of attack position on the bike. So that brings me to the last thing here, comfort, suspension, whatever you want to call it. I've got a BRP rubber mounted handlebar clamp here with a Scott steering stabilizer. The combination of these two things really adds a lot to the bike. You don't really know you need it until you ride without it. If you go from this bike to a bike that doesn't have rubber mounted bars and a steering stabilizer, the bike will feel very vibey. You can feel a lot of vibration through your hands. And it'll also feel like the front end is a lot more loose than maybe you want it in really rough, rocky stuff. Here in Arizona, we ride on like baby heads meaning softball-sized rocks almost all the time. So keeping the front end tracking straight is that's what the steering stabilizer does really well, and it makes it a lot easier on your body to do longer rides. You don't need a steering stabilizer. If the suspension in the bike is set up perfectly, theoretically, you should be just fine without a steering stabilizer. And I really don't run this thing cranked up all the way. I just run it kind of loose, but it seems to help, especially when there's kind of like one of those big jolts that kind of comes out of nowhere. Speaking of comfort as well, I run these ODI Rogue MX grips. They're these soft compound, kind of larger grips. I have larger hands, so I find that there's even less vibration that comes through the bars with those types of ODI grips. So other than all that, I've just got some other fun things on the bike, like the Tusk billet ignition cover and billet clutch cover. On the factory YZ250X, the ignition cover is a plastic cover, which I always hated for some reason. And as you can kind of see here, I've got kind of a gray-black color scheme going with the bike. These are the Acerbis Nardo gray plastics that I think are really cool. I accidentally realized that afterwards that I matched my truck to my bike, which is really kind of stupid. But I really liked adding the black ignition and clutch cover on the bike to make it kind of all blend together in a really nice way. I've also got like a TM Designs black plastic case saver over here on the left-hand side. That's also just adds a kind of a nice black and gray touch to the bike. And you can see there's some little blue accents here and there. But that's all just aesthetics. Everything else I talked about is kind of all you would need to make this bike kind of perfect. Anybody that'll let ride this bike is just kind of blown away with the term balanced comes up a lot. It just feels super balanced and super, you can ride very confidently into very hard stuff. It'll just kind of eat up anything you could possibly throw at it. And the motor is really well behaved, but has plenty of power when you need it. And it's just a great bike. So for all the people out there that, you know, are thinking about going out and buying KTM 250 or 300 TPI, well, you can kind of get to a similar place with the Smart Carb on the YZ250X or an older KTM, but have just a very, very simple bike, still have a headlight, and end up in a place that's pretty cool for probably a lot cheaper. These YZ250Xs don't have that same premium cost that those KTMs have on the market right now. For some reason, KTMs seem to be worth more than gold. It's probably a COVID thing, but you can still get YZ250Xs for a reasonable price and end up with something that's a lot simpler and has a far less things to break. You know, if it goes out on the trail, you can probably figure out what's wrong pretty darn quickly. And it's overall a fantastic bike. Anybody who has not ridden a YZ250X, highly recommend you do it. It kind of has this nostalgia of older bikes to it, but it still performs as good as many of the modern KTMs in a lot of ways. I've got a KTM 500 XCFW, and that bike definitely handles a little bit better. You can kind of tell that the chassis works a little bit better. But this thing just has this kind of brute force element to it where it can kind of take anything you throw at it. It'll just keep going. It's not as finicky. There's the maintenance is just basically just change the air filter and the oil and keep good two-stroke oil in it, and you'll be good to go for a very long time. I will say too that this bike has about 70 hours on it. I have done a new top end with a Wiseco piston. It did seem to run a little bit better with that new piston, which makes sense, right? It had 55, 60 hours on it. So I was getting a little bit tired, but I actually changed the top end, not because I thought that it needed it from a clearance perspective, but because the stock piston is cast and I was worried about the skirts actually getting cracks in it and potentially damaging the engine. So something to think about is that these engines are meant to be raced really hard, whereas KTMs kind of seem to be more like built for trail riding. And even though the maintenance intervals are just the same as this, the KTM seem to be able to go 200 hours on a top end, whereas this thing I got a little bit more worried about when it said you should be doing top ends at 10 hours. So something to think about. But overall, it's a fantastic bike. I highly recommend trying out a YZ250X for a few seasons if you haven't, or just getting one. It's a fantastic bike, and you can make it. There's so many aftermarket parts for this bike. It's so cool. There's pretty much anything you can possibly imagine that you can put on this thing because YZ250s have not changed that much since 2006. So you're talking about a service life now of over 15 years. You can do anything you want to it. watching this episode here at Source ADV, the overview of this 2019 Yamaha YZ250X Ultimate Single Track build. If you have any questions about this bike or any of our other projects, just use the comment section below. We're pretty good about getting back to people pretty quickly, or just want to chat about bikes, you know, camp spots, dog grooming. That's not a thing. Whatever. You know, use the section below. Subscribe to the channel. We've got a lot more cool projects coming out. Appreciate you watching. Take care out there and enjoy the ride.